No one dared to touch the Korean Mafia boss's blind little girl, until a black single mother did the unthinkable and reached for her hands. The screams in the first-class cabin weren't just loud. They were jagged, the sound of a child lost in a world she couldn't see. Every passenger in the car stiffened, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise before quickly snapping away in terror. They weren't afraid of the child. They were afraid of the man sitting beside her. Jin-Ho Kang sat like a statue of carved obsidian, his bespoke blazer straining against shoulders that usually carried the weight of a criminal empire. Tattoos of dragons coiled up his neck, disappearing into his hairline, symbols of a man who dealt in absolute control. But as 6-year-old Hana thrashed in her seat, her sightless eyes wide and glassy with a sensory meltdown, the dragon of Seoul looked utterly powerless. His jaw was clamped so tight it looked ready to snap. For all his guards and all his gold, he couldn't bridge the darkness for his daughter. He reached out to steady her, his movements stiff and intimidating, but his touch only made her shriek louder. He was a king whose throne was a high-speed train, and his only subject was a daughter he was losing to the dark. Then the heavy silence of the cabin was broken by the sound of footsteps. Monica Davis didn't look at the holsters beneath the guards' jackets. She didn't flinch at Jin-Ho's predatory gaze. She simply knelt in the aisle, her presence a sudden, warm anchor in the storm, and reached for the hands that no one else dared to touch. On this channel, we bring you new emotional mafia stories, dropping regularly. Hit subscribe and join the Cold Boss family. The luxury cabin of the KTX high-speed train was a sanctuary of hushed whispers and the soft hum of magnetic rails until the screaming started. It wasn't the rhythmic crying of an infant or the impatient whine of a bored toddler. It was a jagged, visceral sound, the sound of a child drowning in a world she couldn't see. Hana Kang, 6 years old and dressed in a lace-collared dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was thrashing in her plush leather seat. Her sightless eyes, wide and glassy, darted frantically as if searching for a sliver of light that wasn't there. To Hana, the train wasn't a marvel of modern engineering. It was a sensory nightmare. The metallic screech of the tracks, the pressurized pop of the air as they entered a tunnel, and the scent of expensive perfumes and recycled oxygen were all physical blows against her fragile composure. Beside her, Jin-Ho Kang sat like a statue carved from obsidian. To the underworld of Seoul, he was the dragon, a man whose whisper could collapse a construction firm and whose silence was a death sentence. His charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, hiding the thick corded muscle of his shoulders and the holster tucked beneath his arm. But as he looked at his daughter, his composure was a brittle mask. His jaw was clamped so tight the bone looked ready to snap. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over Hana's shoulder. He wanted to pull her to him, to shield her from the darkness, but the last time he had tried, she had recoiled as if his touch were molten lead. "Hanaya," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that lacked its usual authority. "Listen to Appa's voice, you're safe." The girl didn't hear him. She let out a fresh wail, her tiny hands clawing at the air, accidentally striking the window. The sound of her knuckles hitting the glass sent a jolt of electricity through Jin-Ho. He stood up, his sudden movement causing the 2 bodyguards at the end of the cabin to snap to attention, their hands reflexively moving toward their lapels. The other passengers in the first-class cabin buried their faces in their tablets and newspapers, their bodies vibrating with a primal, secondary fear. They weren't just annoyed by the noise. They were terrified of the man who couldn't stop it. They knew who he was. They had seen the headlines about the unfortunate accident that had taken his wife's life and left his only heir in darkness. To look at Jin-Ho now was to look at a predator whose cage had been opened from the inside. "Make it stop," Jin-Ho hissed, not to the guards, but to the empty air. His eyes were wild, flickering with a raw, unfiltered panic that he hadn't felt since the night of the crash. He was a man who solved problems with a checkbook or a blade, yet he was currently being defeated by a 40-pound child's grief. He felt the weight of every judgmental eye in the car, even though no one dared to look. He felt the crushing inadequacy of his own power. He could buy this entire train line, he could burn the city to the ground to keep her safe, but he couldn't reach into the void and pull his daughter back to the light. Hana's breathing became a series of hitching, terrifying gasps. She was hyperventilating, her small frame shaking with a force that threatened to break her. Jin-Ho leaned over her, his shadow falling across her face, his own breath coming in ragged bursts. "Hana, stop, please," he pleaded, the command dying in his throat and turning into a desperate prayer. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with the scent of expensive leather and the metallic tang of cold sweat. The silence of the observers was deafening, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Just as Jin-Ho reached out again, his fingers trembling with a helplessness that felt like a betrayal of his bloodline, a shadow fell across the aisle. The guards shifted, their eyes narrowing as a woman stood up from a few rows back. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have a badge. She wore a simple denim jacket and carried the calm, weary grace of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer and chose to remain soft anyway. Jin-Ho turned, his gaze lethal, a warning written in the very set of his brow. He was ready to destroy anyone who witnessed his failure any longer. But the woman didn't look at his tattoos. She didn't look at the guards. She looked at Hana, and for the first time in an hour, someone in that cabin wasn't breathing with fear. The dragon of Seoul stood frozen as the woman took a step forward, venturing into the radius of a man most people would die to avoid. The tension in the cabin was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to expand with every one of Hana's ragged sobs. Jin-Ho's guards moved with practiced, lethal synchronization, stepping into the aisle to intercept the intruder. Their suits bulged over suppressed weapons, their faces masks of professional hostility. They were trained to neutralize threats, and in their world, any unauthorized approach to the chairman's daughter was a threat. "Back away," the lead guard barked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. Monica Davis didn't stop. She didn't even look at the man's hand as it reached for her shoulder. She moved with a quiet, focused intentionality that bypassed the usual rules of engagement. To Monica, the guns and the glowering men were white noise. She had spent a decade in underfunded community centers and hospital waiting rooms. She knew the difference between a man who wanted to hurt someone and a man who was simply terrified. "She can't breathe," Monica said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a steady, melodic frequency that cut through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog. She looked directly at Jin-Ho, meeting the cold, predatory steel of his eyes with a gaze that was neither defiant nor submissive. It was simply human. "You're crowding her. She's terrified because she can't find the edges of the room. You're making the world feel like it's collapsing on her." Jin-Ho froze. His hand was still hovering near the holster beneath his jacket, his instincts screaming at him to remove this woman from his sight. But there was something in her tone, a profound, unshakable authority, that stayed his hand. He looked down at Hana, whose face was turning a haunting shade of pale, her fingers clawing at the leather upholstery as if trying to dig a hole into the earth. With a sharp, microscopic nod, Jin-Ho signaled his men to stand down. They retreated a fraction, though their eyes remained fixed on Monica's throat. Monica knelt in the carpeted aisle, sinking down until she was at Hana's level. She didn't reach for the girl immediately. Instead, she began to hum. It wasn't a recognizable song, just a low, rhythmic vibration that pulsed at a steady 60 beats per minute, the pace of a resting heart. The change wasn't instant, but it was visible. Hana's head tilted. The jagged edge of her screaming softened into a whimper. The girl's world was a terrifying kaleidoscope of sharp sounds and cold touches, but this new sound was different. It was soft. It felt like velvet. "Hana," Monica whispered, her voice a gentle anchor. "My name is Monica. I'm sitting right here on the floor. I'm not going to grab you. I'm just going to put my hand on the armrest, okay? You can find me when you're ready." Jin-Ho watched, his breath held in his chest. He had spent millions on the best child psychologists and sensory experts in Korea, and all of them had approached Hana with clinical detachment or forced cheerfulness. This woman was doing neither. She was simply existing in the dark with her. Slowly, tentatively, Hana's trembling hand drifted away from the window. Her fingers brushed the denim of Monica's sleeve. She flinched, but Monica didn't move. She remained as still as a stone in a stream. Hana reached out again, her small palm finding Monica's hand. "That's it," Monica murmured. "I'm right here. The world isn't falling apart, Hana. It's just big. Let's make it smaller." Monica took Hana's tiny, cold hand in her own. She didn't pull, she guided. She lifted the girl's hand and placed it gently against her own jawline. Jin-Ho's posture spiked with tension. The sight of a stranger touching his daughter was an affront to every protective instinct he possessed, but he remained silent. "Can you feel that?" Monica asked as she moved Hana's fingers toward her mouth. "I'm smiling, Hana. Do you know what a smile feels like?" Hana's sightless eyes remained unfocused, but her brow furrowed in concentration. Her fingertips traced the curve of Monica's lips, the slight crinkle at the corner of her mouth, and the warmth of her skin. "A smile is a curve that goes up," Monica explained softly, moving the girl's hand to the apples of her cheeks, which were lifted in a genuine maternal grin. "It means you're safe. It means I'm happy to meet you. When the world feels too loud, you just have to find the smile." For the first time since the train had left the station, Hana's breathing leveled out. The hyperventilation stopped. A single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek, landing on Monica's thumb. Hana leaned forward, her forehead almost touching Monica, seeking the warmth of this stranger who had found her in the void. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of fear or judgment. It was the heavy, sacred silence of a miracle. The passengers watched in hushed awe as the dragon's daughter finally went still, her small body sagging with relief against the woman in the aisle. Jin-Ho looked down at them, his face still a mask of granite, but his eyes were betraying him. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't looking at his daughter as a broken thing to be fixed or a legacy to be protected. He was looking at a child who had finally been seen. He looked at Monica, really looked at her, knotting the tired lines around her eyes and the steadiness of her hands. She was a woman of no apparent status, no weapons, and no guards. Yet she had done in 3 minutes what his entire empire couldn't do in 3 years. Hana's hand stayed on Monica's cheek, her fingers memorizing the shape of the kindness she had found. The train roared on through the night, but inside the cabin, the darkness had finally lost its teeth. The train decelerated as it approached Seoul station, the magnetic brakes emitting a low, mournful hum that usually would have sent Hana back into a spiral of distress. But she remained quiet, her small hand still resting in Monica's palm, her thumb tracing the lifelines of a stranger's skin. For Jin-Ho, the silence was more unsettling than the screaming had been. It was a vacuum that highlighted the gaping hole in his own life. The realization that his daughter had found more comfort in a woman she had known for 10 minutes than in the man who would die to keep her breathing. When the doors hissed open, Monica gave Hana's hand a final, supportive squeeze. "You did so well, Hana. Remember, the world is only as big as what you can touch." She stood up, brushing the dust from her jeans, and offered Jin-Ho a nod that was polite but final. She didn't ask for a reward. She didn't wait for a thank you. She simply adjusted her bag on her shoulder and disappeared into the stream of departing passengers. Jin-Ho watched her go, his eyes narrowing. "Follow her," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that didn't reach Hana's ears. His lead guard, a man named Minkyu, didn't need further instructions. He slipped into the crowd, a shadow following the sun. 2 hours later, Jin-Ho sat in the back of a black sedan idling at the curb of a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. He looked at the dossier Minkyu had handed him. Monica Davis, former pediatric specialist, single mother, living on a visa that was as precarious as her bank balance. She was a woman who had spent her life helping children who fell through the cracks, only to find herself standing on the edge of one. He stepped out of the car, his presence immediately clashing with the weathered brick and sagging laundry lines of the neighborhood. He didn't bring his full security detail. He knew that to bring a small army would be to lose the woman before the conversation began. He climbed the narrow stairs, the scent of charcoal grill and exhaust filling his lungs, until he reached door 4B. He knocked once, sharp, authoritative. When Monica opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She looked tired. She was holding a toddler on her hip, a boy with messy curls who was rubbing sleep from his eyes. She looked at the man in the $5,000 suit standing in her hallway and didn't blink. "You're a hard man to hide from, I assume," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "I am a man who protects his interests," Jin-Ho replied, his Korean accent thick but precise. He looked past her into the small, cramped living room. It was filled with toys, books, and the unmistakable warmth of a home that was lived in, not just maintained. It was the polar opposite of his own cold, echoing estate. "My daughter has not spoken since we left the train. She is waiting for the humming to start again." Monica's expression softened, but her posture remained guarded. "She isn't waiting for humming, Mr. Kang. She's waiting for a connection. She's been living in a world of commands and safety protocols. She needs a map made of textures and sounds." "Then draw it for her," Jin-Ho said. He didn't move, but the air around him seemed to tighten. "I want you to come to my home. I want you to be her guide. Not a nanny, not a nurse. You will be her sensory guide. You will teach her how to navigate the dark so that she is no longer a prisoner to it." Monica let out a short, dry laugh. "You're offering me a job, after your men looked like they wanted to snap my neck on the KTX. "I am offering you a life of absolute security," Jin-Ho corrected. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a tone that was dangerously sincere. "I know your visa status is nearing its end. I know the hospitals here have been slow to hire a foreigner with a child. In my house, you will be untouchable. Your son will have the best education, the best care, and in return, you give my daughter back her life." Monica looked at her son, then back at the man who was essentially a king of the shadows. She saw the desperation he was trying so hard to hide beneath his pride. It was in the way his hand twitched toward his pocket, the way he couldn't quite maintain eye contact when he mentioned Hana's silence. He was a man used to buying everything, realizing he was currently begging for the one thing money couldn't manufacture: empathy. "I don't work for the dragon," Monica said firmly. "I work for Hana. If I see a gun, I leave. If I feel like she's being treated like a broken doll instead of a little girl, I leave. Do you understand?" Jin-Ho felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: respect. Most people approached him with their heads bowed, looking for a way to serve or a way to steal. This woman was setting terms to a man who didn't take them. "The guns stay in the holsters," Jin-Ho promised, a slight tilt of his head acknowledging her terms. "But the protection remains. You and your son move in tomorrow." He turned to leave, but stopped at the top of the stairs. "One more thing, Ms. Davis." "Yes." "Why did you do it? On the train. You knew who I was, you saw the guards, why take the risk?" Monica shifted the weight of her son on her hip. "Because a child was crying in the dark, and you were too busy being a boss to be a father. Someone had to bridge the gap." Jin-Ho didn't respond. He walked down the stairs, his footsteps heavy. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but as he reached the bottom, he realized he had just invited the one person who knew exactly how to tear them down. The black sedan glided through the iron gates of the Kang, a state like a shark returning to its reef. As the vehicle wound up the long, manicured driveway, Monica pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her son Andre asleep against her shoulder. The house that loomed ahead was an architectural masterpiece of glass, steel, and cold gray stone, perched on a cliffside overlooking the sea. It was beautiful, but it was a fortress, designed to keep the world out rather than invite the light in. When the doors were opened by silent men in dark suits, the air that greeted Monica was sterile and unnervingly quiet. There was no hum of a television, no clatter of dishes, just the heavy, pressurized silence of a mausoleum. Jin-Ho was waiting in the grand foyer, his silhouette framed by a massive floor-to-ceiling window. He looked less like a father and more like a sentinel guarding a tomb. "Welcome," he said, though the word felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Your quarters are in the East Wing. Hana is upstairs. She hasn't left her room since this morning." Monica didn't go to her room first. She settled Andre with a trusted housekeeper and then began to walk the halls of the Dragon's Den. As she moved through the house, the weight of it pressed against her chest. Every surface was polished to a mirror finish. Every piece of art was encased in glass. There were no family photos, no discarded toys, no signs of the messy, vibrant chaos of childhood. The house was a museum of grief, preserved in the exact state it had been the day Jin-Ho's wife died. It was a place where sound went to die, and for a blind child, that was the most dangerous environment possible. To Hana, this house wasn't a home, it was a void. "This won't work," Monica said, her voice echoing too sharply against the marble floors as she returned to the foyer where Jin-Ho remained. Jin-Ho stiffened, his eyes flashing with a mix of offense and curiosity. "The estate is the most secure private residence in the country. She has everything she needs." "She has nothing she can use," Monica countered, her tone steady but firm. "It's too quiet, Jin-Ho. When you can't see, silence isn't peaceful, it's a predatory animal. It's a lack of information. She's living in a sensory vacuum, and that's why she's terrified to move. We're changing it, today." Jin-Ho watched, arms crossed, as Monica began her redecoration. She didn't move furniture or hang paintings. Instead, she went to the kitchen and returned with a handful of dried beans, a set of wind chimes she'd brought in her own luggage, and a collection of textured rugs. Under Jin-Ho's bewildered gaze, Monica began to create a map of sound and touch. She hung the chimes near the air conditioning vents so they would chime softly, marking the location of the hallways. She placed a rough sisal rug at the base of the stairs and a soft, high-pile runner leading toward the dining room. "She needs landmarks," Monica explained, kneeling to secure a strip of textured tape along the wainscoting at Hana's hand level. "If the floor feels the same everywhere, she's lost. If every room sounds like a tomb, she's buried. We're going to give her a trail she can follow without needing a hand to hold." Next came the light. Monica walked to the heavy, blackout curtains that shrouded the house in a perpetual twilight and threw them wide. The sudden intrusion of the afternoon sun hit the marble floors, reflecting in brilliant, dancing patches. "She's blind, Monica," Jin-Ho said, his voice dropping to a low, pained rasp. "The light doesn't matter." "Light is heat," Monica corrected softly, stepping into a pool of sunshine. "She can feel the warmth on her skin. It tells her where the windows are. It tells her it's day. It tells her the world is still turning." Monica then pulled out a small, portable speaker and began to play a low, ambient track of rainforest sounds, the gentle patter of rain and the distant call of birds. It was subtle, but it filled the sterile vacuum of the house with a rhythmic life force. Finally, she led Jin-Ho up to Hana's door. The girl was sitting in the center of her oversized bed, her knees tucked to her chest, a small, fragile island in a sea of expensive silk. Monica didn't enter. Instead, she reached out and tapped a rhythmic pattern on the wooden doorframe, shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Inside the room, Hana's head snapped toward the sound. Her sightless eyes didn't focus, but her body relaxed. She recognized the rhythm. She recognized the smile in the sound. "Hana," Monica called out, her voice warm and inviting. "Follow the sound of the bells. There's a sun patch in the hallway that feels like a hug. Come and find it." Jin-Ho stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching as his daughter tentatively slid off the bed. Her feet found the new, textured rug Monica had placed by the door. She paused, her toes curling into the fibers, a look of wonder crossing her face. She reached out, her fingers finding the textured tape on the wall, and began to guide herself toward the door. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't trembling, she was navigating. As Hana reached the doorway and felt the warmth of the sun on her face, a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. Jin-Ho felt a lump form in his throat that no amount of power could swallow. He looked at Monica, who was watching Hana with a look of quiet triumph. The dragon's den was no longer a tomb. It was becoming a classroom. But as Jin-Ho watched the light play across the floor, he knew that opening his house to the light also meant making it visible to his enemies. He had allowed a healer into his fortress, and for the first time in his life, he felt the terrifying vulnerability of having something worth losing. The transition from a fortress to a home did not happen in the architecture, but in the air itself. A week had passed since Monica's arrival, and the Kang estate now hummed with a different frequency. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the soft tinkling of chimes and the occasional rhythmic thud of Andre's toy trucks in the nursery wing. But for Jin-Ho, the most profound change was the way he moved through his own halls. He found himself pausing in the sun patches Monica had pointed out, testing the warmth on his skin, trying to understand a world he had previously only seen through the lens of tactical advantage and aesthetic perfection. He found them in the sunroom, a glass-walled space that overlooked the churning gray sea. Hana was sitting on a plush rug, her lap filled with various objects Monica had gathered, a pine cone, a piece of smooth sea glass, a velvet ribbon. Monica was behind her, but she wasn't doing the work. She was watching Jin-Ho, who stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, looking like a man who wanted to enter a room but didn't know if he was invited. "She knows you're there," Monica said, her voice catching the light. "She can hear the way your leather shoes creak. She can smell the sandalwood of your cologne. But to her, you're just a statue that breathes. You're a shadow that stays in the corner." Jin-Ho flinched. The dragon did not flinch, yet the word shadow stung more than any blade. "I do not want to startle her. I have been told that for the blind, sudden contact is aggressive." "Then don't be sudden," Monica said. She stood up and gestured for him to take her place. "Sit down, Jin-Ho. Get off your pedestal and get on the floor." It was a command that would have cost anyone else their tongue. Jin-Ho hesitated, his expensive suit trousers straining as he lowered himself onto the rug. He felt absurd, a king sitting in the dirt, but as he sat, Hana's head tilted. She reached out a hand, waving it through the air until her fingers brushed his knee. She didn't recoil. She stayed there, exploring the rough texture of his suit. "Talk to her," Monica whispered. "But don't just use words. She's heard enough be carefuls, and I'm here's. Show her who you are through what she can touch." Jin-Ho looked at his hands that had signed off on brutal takeovers and clenched into fists in dark alleys. They were large, scarred, and calloused. He reached out, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythmic violence, and took a piece of sea glass from the pile. He took Hana's small, delicate hand in his. "Hanaya," he murmured, his voice thick. "Feel this. It's from the beach below the cliff. It used to be a bottle, sharp and broken, but the ocean tumbled it for years. It fought the waves until the edges became soft, like you." He guided her fingers over the frosted, rounded surface of the glass. Hana's face was a mask of intense concentration. She traced the glass, then moved her fingers up to Jin-Ho's palm, feeling the thick, raised scar that ran from his thumb to his wrist, a remnant of a night he never spoke of. "You are strong," she whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost to the sound of the waves outside. "Not as strong as you," Jin-Ho replied, and he realized he meant it. Monica moved closer, leaning in with a playful glint in her eyes. "He's too serious, isn't he, Hana? He talks like a history book. Let's see if we can find the person under the suit." Monica reached out and began to tickle Hana's ribs. The girl let out a small, startled gasp, her body tensing, and then it happened. It started as a tiny, melodic chirrup, like a bird waking up, and then it blossomed into a full, chest-deep giggle. The sound hit Jin-Ho like a physical blow. He hadn't heard Hana laugh since before the screech of tires and the smell of burning rubber had redefined their lives. It was a beautiful, chaotic sound that shattered the curated gloom of the estate. "Your turn," Monica challenged, nudging Jin-Ho's shoulder. Jin-Ho looked horrified. I am not a man of tickling." "Then be a man of bubbles," Monica said, handing him a small plastic wand and a jar of soapy water she had hidden behind her back. "Blow them toward her face. She can feel the pop of the water when they land. It's a game of surprise." Jin-Ho took the wand as if it were a detonator. He dipped it, blew a breath that was far too forced, and watched a cluster of iridescent spheres drift toward his daughter. One popped against Hana's nose. She squealed, her hands flying up to touch her face, her sightless eyes crinkling with pure, unadulterated joy. "Again," she cried out, "Apper again." Jin-Ho blew again, and then again, his movements losing their rigidity. He found himself leaning forward, laughing under his breath as Hana tried to catch the bubbles, her movements graceful and sure. In that moment, the dragon vanished. There was no Chairman Kang, no syndicate leader, no blood-soaked legacy. There was only a father sitting in a puddle of soapy water, captivated by the sound of his daughter's happiness. The ice that had encased Jin-Ho's heart for 3 years, The guilt of surviving while his wife did not, the shame of his daughter's imperfection, didn't just melt, it shattered. He looked at Monica over Hana's head. She was smiling at them, her expression filled with a quiet, knowing warmth. She had promised to show Hana the world, but he realized she was doing something far more dangerous. She was showing him his own soul. He felt a terrifying surge of gratitude. It made him want to give her everything, and it made him want to hide her from the life he had built. Because as Hana's laughter echoed through the glass room, Jin-Ho knew that the louder their joy became, the easier it would be for his enemies to find the sound. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind Hana's ear, his hand finally steady. "We will do this every day," he promised. "Every day," Hana repeated, leaning her head against his shoulder. For the first time since the accident, Jin-Ho didn't look at the door to see who was coming. He looked at his daughter, and he saw a future that didn't require him to be a monster. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the rug, he knew the monsters wouldn't let him leave that easily. The piece of the Kang estate was a fragile glass ornament, beautiful and translucent, but ultimately incapable of withstanding the weight of the world outside. For Monica, the illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday evening when the sun was a bruised purple against the horizon. She had been heading to the kitchen to prepare a snack for Andre when she took a wrong turn at the end of the East Gallery, her footsteps silenced by one of the new, thick runners she had installed. The door to Jin-Ho's private study was slightly ajar. Usually, the room was a silent vacuum, but tonight, it bled a cold, sharp energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Through the gap in the door, she saw a side of Jin-Ho that the sunroom bubbles had momentarily washed away. He wasn't sitting, he was looming. He stood behind a massive desk of petrified wood, his blazer discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the full, snarling length of the dragons tattooed on his forearms. Before him, two men knelt on the floor, not with the reverence of Hana's play, but with the bone-deep tremors of the condemned. Their faces were bloodied, the metallic scent of it drifting into the hallway. Standing behind them was Minkayu, his hand resting casually on a heavy baton. "You thought you could skim from the Busan transit contracts," Jin-Ho said. His voice wasn't the warm rumble he used with Hana. It was a glacier grinding over stone. "You thought my daughter's condition made me soft, that I was too distracted by toys and chimes to notice a 5% discrepancy." "Chairman, please," one of the men sobbed, his forehead hitting the marble. "We have families." "So do I," Jin-Ho interrupted. He stepped around the desk, his movements predatory and precise. He grabbed the man by the hair, forcing his head back. "And my family depends on the absolute certainty that when I give an order, it is followed. When I protect a territory, it is mine. You didn't just steal money. You stole the security of my home." He nodded to Minkayu. The sound that followed, the dull, sickening thud of the baton against ribs and the muffled cry of agony, sent a jolt of ice through Monica's veins. She didn't scream, but she stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. Jin-Ho's head snapped toward the door. In an instant, his eyes shifted from the cold calculation of a predator to something frantic and exposed. He released the man's hair and stood upright, but the transformation was incomplete. He was still covered in the aura of violence. "Monica," he said, his voice cracking the silence. She didn't wait. She turned and ran, not toward her quarters, but toward the sunroom, the place where they had just hours before been a family. She reached the glass walls and gripped the railing, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A moment later, the heavy door groaned open. Jin-Ho entered, his sleeves still rolled up, the blood of another man a small, dark blossom on his cuff. "Leave," she said, her back to him. "Monica, listen to me. That is the world I live in. Those men would have burned this house down with you and Andre inside if they thought I was weak. My violence is the only reason you are safe." Monica turned around, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. "Don't you dare use us to justify that. Don't you dare lay that blood at my feet or Hana." She gestured toward the hallway, toward the room where a blind girl was sleeping in a world Monica had worked so hard to make gentle. "I spent all day teaching her that the world is soft. I taught her that a touch means love and a voice means safety. And 10 feet away, you're breaking bones and crushing souls. I am the dragon of Seoul, Jin-Ho hissed, his pride flaring like a dying ember. I cannot be a saint and keep this empire. Then don't be a saint. Monica stepped closer, ignoring the danger she had been warned about since the train. She poked a finger into his chest, right over his pounding heart. But you cannot be a monster by day and a father by night. You think children don't know? You think Hana can't feel the vibration of your anger? You think she won't smell the copper on your hands? Jin-Ho looked down at her, his jaw working. He was used to being feared, used to being obeyed. He wasn't used to being held accountable to a moral compass he had discarded years ago. The darkness you live in is infectious, Jin-Ho, Monica continued, her voice dropping to a low, painful whisper. If you keep bringing it into this house, you will undo everything. You will make her world small and terrifying again. You'll be the very thing she needs to be protected from. What do you want from me? He asked, and for the first time, he sounded truly defeated. An ultimatum, Monica said. You find a way to bleed the dragon dry. You start moving your business into the light, or you find someone else to guide your daughter. Because I will not help you raise a child who is destined to be the heir to a graveyard. I won't let my son grow up watching a man play God with other people's lives. Jin-Ho looked at the bloodstain on his sleeve. He looked at the woman who had brought laughter back into a house of ghosts. He realized with a terrifying clarity that she was the only person in the world who wasn't afraid of him, and that made her the only person who could truly save him. It will take time, he said, his voice barely audible over the crashing of the waves below. A man in my position, you don't just walk away. The shadows have a long reach. Then start walking now, Monica said, her gaze unwavering. Before the shadows reach her. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his, leaving him alone in the glass room. Jin-Ho stood there for a long time, watching his own reflection in the dark windows. He saw a man who had everything, yet possessed nothing that wasn't paid for in pain. He looked at his tattooed arms, and for the first time in his life, they didn't feel like armor. They felt like shackles. The storm that broke over the Kang estate that night was not made of rain or thunder, but of the rhythmic, muffled thump-thump of suppressed gunfire. Jin-Ho had been away in the city, negotiating the first of the legal divestments Monica had demanded, leaving the fortress under the watch of his most trusted men. Monica was in the nursery, tucked into the oversized armchair with Hana curled against her side, reading a book of Braille poetry. Andre was asleep in the crib nearby, his breathing the only sound in the room, until the chimes in the hallway didn't just tinkle, they shrieked as a body collided with the wall. Monica froze. The map she had built was talking to her. The heavy, dragging sound on the sisal rug meant someone was injured. The sudden silence of the rainforest ambient track meant the power had been cut to the wing. Monica, Hana whispered, her fingers tightening on the book. The birds stopped singing. Why did the birds stop? It's a game, Hanaya, Monica said, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm that she forced out of her voice. She stood up, scooping Andre into her arms and reaching for Hana's hand. Remember the quiet mouse game? We have to get to the secret garden in the walls without making a single sound. If we win, we get to see the sunrise. The secret garden was a reinforced panic room hidden behind the wainscoting of the library. But to get there, they had to cross the open gallery. Monica led them out into the hall. The emergency lights cast a haunting, flickering crimson glow over the marble. She could smell it before she saw it, the sharp, metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of cordite. She saw Minkayu slumped against a pedestal, his hand still gripping his radio. He looked at her, eyes wide with a desperate warning, and feebly pointed toward the stairs. The intruders were moving with professional precision. They weren't just thugs. They were a cleanup crew sent by the rivals Jin-Ho was trying to leave behind. Shoes off, Monica breathed into Hana's ear. They stepped onto the cold floor. Monica used the textures she had installed to guide them in the dark. Rough rug means the corner. Soft silk means the doorway. She watched the shadows at the end of the hall. 2 men in tactical gear rounded the corner, their flashlights cutting through the dark like serrated blades. Hana, stay on the soft path, Monica whispered. They ducked into a recessed alcove just as a beam of light swept over the spot where they had stood a second before. Hana was trembling, her sightless eyes darting, her breath beginning to hitch in that jagged, terrifying way that preceded a meltdown. If she screamed now, they were dead. Monica knelt, pressing her forehead against Hana's. She took the girl's small, shaking hands and placed them on her own chest. Rhythm, Hana, follow my heartbeat like the bubbles remember. Pop, pop, pop. Monica began to tap a slow, steady beat on Hana's palm. It was the sensory bridge they had practiced for weeks, a tactile language that bypassed the ears. Tap-tap meant wait. Long press meant breathe. One of the gunmen was 10 feet away. Monica could hear the crunch of his boots on the glass shards of a broken vase. She felt Andre stir in her arms, a soft whimper escaping his lips. She quickly offered him her finger to suck on, silencing him with the familiar comfort. Hana's eyes were squeezed shut. She was vibrating with the effort to stay silent, her fingers digging into Monica's denim jacket. She couldn't see the man with the suppressed submachine gun, but she could hear the click of his safety and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart. In the dark, her hearing was a superpower, and right now, it was a curse. The air, Hana mouthed, her voice a ghost of a sound. It smells like cold pennies. I know, Monica signaled against her palm. Keep your eyes on the inside, Hana. Find the sun patch in your mind. The gunman paused at their alcove. The light swept inches from Monica's shoes. She held her breath until her lungs burned, her entire existence narrowed down to the pressure of Hana's hand in hers. The man grunted, signaled to his partner, and moved toward the master suite. They moved. Monica guided Hana along the wainscoting, their fingers skimming the textured tape. Every chime they passed was a risk, every rug a milestone. They reached the library door, the heavy oak providing a final barrier. Monica triggered the hidden latch. As the stone panel slid open, she ushered the children inside the small, steel-lined room. Only when the door hissed shut and the electromagnetic locks engaged did Monica allow herself to collapse against the wall, her lungs finally drawing in a ragged, shuddering breath. Hana didn't cry. She sat on the floor, her hands searching for Monica's face. When she found it, she didn't feel the smile she had been taught to look for. She felt the wetness of tears and the frantic pulse in Monica's jaw. We won the game, didn't we? Hana whispered. We're winning, Monica said, pulling both children into her lap. We're winning, baby. Outside, the muffled sounds of the final confrontation erupted. The arrival of Jin-Ho's secondary team, the screech of tires, and the unmistakable roar of a man who had discovered his sanctuary had been breached. Minutes later, the intercom in the panic room crackled. Monica, open the door, it's over, please. Jin-Ho's voice was broken, stripped of all its draconic fury, leaving only the raw terror of a father. When Monica opened the door, she saw him standing in the wreckage of the library. He was covered in dust and glass, his hands shaking as he reached for them. He didn't look at the tactical team clearing the hallways or the bodies being carried out. He looked at Hana, who was standing tall, her hand still resting on Monica's shoulder. She stayed quiet, Jin-Ho whispered, falling to his knees before them. How? Monica looked at the man who had built a fortress of stone, only to have it fail, and then at the girl who had built a fortress of spirit. Because she wasn't in the dark, Jin-Ho, Monica said, her voice weary but sharp. She knew exactly where she was. She had a map. But if you ever subject her to this again, if you ever let the cold pennies back into this house, there won't be enough maps in the world to find her again. Jin-Ho pulled them both into his arms, burying his face in Hana's hair. The dragon was gone. Only the man remained, and for the first time, he looked like he was ready to burn the empire down himself if it meant never seeing that look in Monica's eyes again. The aftermath of the attack hung over the estate like a thick, toxic fog. While the glass shards had been swept away, and the cold penny scent of blood scrubbed from the marble, the silence that remained was no longer the peaceful, quiet Monica had cultivated. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a standoff. Jin-Ho spent 48 hours in his study, the doors locked, the only sound the low murmur of phone calls that seemed to span every time zone. When he finally emerged, he didn't look like a victor. His eyes were hollowed out, and his movements were sluggish, burdened by the weight of a choice that would either cement his legacy in blood or erase his future entirely. "The men who breached this house were sent by the council," Jin-Ho said, standing on the terrace where Monica was watching the gray sea. He didn't look at her, he looked at the horizon. "They don't want the money I'm divesting. They want the precedent. They believe that if a dragon is allowed to stop being a monster, the others will lose their fear. They have summoned me to the neutral grounds in Incheon. They expect me to bring the heads of the men who survived the raid. They expect a declaration of war." Monica turned to him, her hands deep in the pockets of her cardigan. "And what do you expect?" "If I go there and spill blood, the cycle starts again. Hana will live her life in a panic room, and you will eventually realize that no amount of light can hide the shadow I cast. But if I don't," he trailed off, his jaw tightening, "if I go there and show mercy, they will see it as a terminal weakness. They will hunt us until there is nothing left." "There is a third way, Jin-Ho," Monica said softly, stepping closer until she was within the radius of his cold, sharp energy. "You've spent your life teaching people to fear you. Try teaching them to need you. You aren't just a man with a gun, you're a man with the keys to the city's infrastructure. You have the maps. Use them." The neutral grounds was a high-rise warehouse overlooking the shipping docks, a place where the air tasted of salt and industrial grease. Inside, the air was thick with the presence of 5 of the most dangerous men in the country, each surrounded by an army of shadows. In the center of the room sat a long table, and at the head of it, a seat was left empty for the dragon. When Jin-Ho entered, he wasn't wearing his tactical gear. He wore the same charcoal suit he had worn on the train, but his hands were empty. He didn't bring the heads of his enemies. He brought a single, slim briefcase. The oldest man at the table, a veteran of the brutal street wars of the 90s, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "You come to us empty-handed, Chairman Kang? Your house was violated. Your blood was spilled. Where is the retribution?" "Retribution is a tax that we all eventually stop being able to pay," Jin-Ho said, his voice a steady, low-frequency hum that commanded the room. He didn't sit. He stood, towering over them. "I could have spent the last 2 days hunting your families. I could have turned the Han River red. We all know I have the capacity, but I chose to do something unthinkable instead." He opened the briefcase and slid a stack of documents onto the table. They weren't hits or threats. They were contracts, legitimate, binding, and incredibly lucrative. "I am exiting the syndicate," Jin-Ho announced. The room erupted in a low, shocked murmur, but he held up a hand. "But I am not leaving a vacuum. I am transitioning my holdings into a logistics and security conglomerate. I am giving each of you a 20% stake in the legal infrastructure of the Busan and Incheon ports. No more skimming, no more hiding. You will be board members, not bosses. You will have wealth that can be passed to your children without a target on their backs." "You're asking us to become businessmen," the old man spat. "You've gone soft, Kang. That woman and that child have turned the dragon into a sheep." Jin-Ho leaned down, his palms flat on the table, his face inches from the other man's. The tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light. "I am giving you the one thing you can't buy with a bullet, a future. If you refuse, I will use every ledger, every recording, and every map I have to ensure that by sunrise, the authorities have enough to bury you for 3 lifetimes. I will burn my empire to the ground, and I will make sure you are all inside when I do." He stood back up, straightening his tie. "You can kill a monster, but you can't kill a man who has nothing left to hide. I am choosing peace because my daughter needs a father more than she needs a king. Choose your seats at the table or choose your cells." The silence that followed was agonizing. For several minutes, the only sound was the distant horn of a container ship. Then, slowly, the old man reached out and pulled the contract toward him. One by one, the others followed. It wasn't a surrender, it was a transition. Jin-Ho had done the one thing his world considered a cardinal sin. He had used diplomacy to end a war before it began. When Jin-Ho returned to the estate, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sea in shades of gold and apricot. He found Monica in the sunroom, her head resting against the glass, asleep. Beside her, Hana was awake, her fingers tracing the braille pages of her book. As Jin-Ho stepped onto the rug, the chimes tinkled softly in the breeze. Hana's head tilted. She didn't flinch. She didn't wait for the sound of a gun or a command. "Appa," she whispered. Jin-Ho knelt beside her. He took her hand and placed it against his cheek. He was crying, the tears silent and hot against his skin. Hana's fingers traced the wetness, moving down to his mouth. She felt the curve. She felt the smile that Monica had taught her to find. "You smell like the sea," Hana said, leaning into him, "and the air feels light." "The air is clear now, Hana," Jin-Ho whispered, pulling her into his lap. Monica stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw the two of them framed by the rising sun, the dragon finally at rest. She didn't need to ask what had happened at the meeting. She could see it in the way Jin-Ho held his daughter, not as a shield, but as a reason. The price of peace had been his power, and looking at the way he was breathing, Monica knew it was the best bargain he had ever made. 6 months had passed since the night the dragon had bargained away his fire for a quiet life. The Kang estate, once a cold monolith of stone and secrets, had undergone a final, permanent transformation. The iron gates still stood, but they were now draped in climbing jasmine and wisteria, and the guards who walked the perimeter had traded their tactical vests for the discreet suits of a high-end security firm. The house no longer echoed, it breathed. The garden Monica had envisioned was finally in full bloom. It wasn't a traditional, manicured Korean garden designed for distant admiration. It was a sensory playground, a living map of fragrance, texture, and sound. There were paths of crushed lavender that released their scent when stepped upon, fountains that bubbled at different musical pitches to act as acoustic landmarks, and a wide variety of flora chosen specifically for the velvet of their petals or the sturdiness of their stalks. Jin-Ho stood at the edge of the koi pond, his sleeves rolled up, watching Andre chase a series of wooden sailboats across the shallow water. There was a lightness to Jin-Ho's posture that would have made his former associates unrecognizable. The tension that had once lived in his jaw had migrated to the corners of his eyes, appearing now as faint crinkles of a hard-won peace. He was no longer the man on the train, paralyzed by a child's cry. He was a man who knew exactly how to listen. "She's by the rosemary," Monica said, stepping up beside him. She looked radiant in a simple linen dress, her hair catching the afternoon light. She held a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea, the clink of the ice serving as a familiar grounding chime. Jin-Ho turned, his gaze softening as it landed on her. For a long time, they had lived in the space between employee and employer, then between allies and friends. Now, that space had vanished. They were 2 people who had survived different kinds of shipwrecks and found themselves on the same shore. Hana was kneeling in a bed of herbs, her fingers dancing over the needle-like leaves of the rosemary. She didn't look like the fragile, lace-covered doll from the KTX first-class cabin. Her knees were stained with soil, and her face was flushed with the heat of the sun. She moved with a confidence that was rhythmic and sure, her body navigating the garden using the anchors Monica had taught her. "Appa, Monica," Hana called out, her head tilting toward the sound of their breathing. "The bees are very busy today. I can hear them in the clover." "They have a lot of work to do, just like us," Jin-Ho replied, walking toward her. He reached down and took Hana's hand, pulling her gently to her feet. Monica joined them, and the 3 of them stood in the center of the fragrant path. It was a moment of profound stillness, the kind that only comes after a great deal of noise. Hana reached out her other hand, searching for Monica. When she found it, she pulled their 3 hands together, interlacing their fingers into a single, complex knot of skin and warmth. "I want to see us," Hana whispered. Monica smiled, a soft, tearful expression that Jin-Ho mirrored. "You are seeing us, Hana, right now." "No," the girl insisted. "The way we did on the train, the shape of us." Jin-Ho knelt so that he was at Hana's level, and Monica followed suit. They formed a tight circle in the dirt. Hana's small hands began to move, a blind sculptor memorizing a masterpiece. She started with Jin-Ho, tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the bridge of his nose, and the slight, permanent scar on his forehead. Then she moved to Monica, feeling the fullness of her lips, the curve of her cheekbones, and the soft texture of her hair. Finally, she brought their hands back together, stacking them one on top of the other. Jin-Ho's large, scarred palm on the bottom, Monica's steady, warm hand in the middle, and Hana's small, soft hand on top. "I see it," Hana said, her voice a hushed vibrato of wonder. "It's a mountain." "A mountain?" Jin-Ho asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," Hana replied, her sightless eyes glowing with an inner light. "The bottom is strong and heavy like the stone. The middle is warm like the trees, and the top is me. We're all holding each other up so we can touch the sky." Monica leaned her head against Jin-Ho's shoulder, and he didn't pull away. He leaned back into her, a man finally letting go of the burden of being the only pillar. The syndicate was a fading memory, a shadow lost to the brilliance of the afternoon. The wealth, the power, the dragon, all of it had been a hollow cage compared to the weight of the small hand resting in his. They stayed there as the sun began its slow descent toward the sea, casting long, golden shadows across the rosemary and the clover. They were a family forged not by blood or tradition, but by the unthinkable courage of a stranger and the desperate hope of a father. As the first of the evening chimes began to sing in the breeze, Hana let out a soft, contented sigh. She didn't need eyes to know that the darkness was gone. She could feel the smile on Jin-Ho's face, the steady beat of Monica's heart, and the warmth of a sun that would never truly set on the home they had built together. The unthinkable act on the train had become there every day. And in the quiet of the garden, among the scent of herbs and the sound of falling water, the
Yes, we
dragon
did.
finally
Together.
slept
Together.
while the father lived.